Wilcoxon, Arizona, July 17, 1995. The dust hadn't settled from the afternoon rodeo when Clara Whitmore walked out of the Cochise County Fairgrounds for the last time. The temperature still hovered near 102 degrees, and the parking lot shimmered with heat waves rising from cracked asphalt. Clara's red sundress clung to her back as she searched through her purse for car keys, the sound of country music and distant laughter echoing behind her. At 32, Clara had the weathered beauty of a woman who'd spent her life under the Arizona sun. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked the ranch alongside her husband, Earl. She'd promised her 2 children she'd be home by 6 to help with homework, but the afternoon had stretched longer than expected. "Clara, wait up." Vernon Whitmore jogged across the parking lot, his cowboy boots kicking up small clouds of dirt. Earl's older brother was a fixture at every community event, his broad smile and easy laugh making him popular with everyone from the bank president to the gas station attendant. Clara turned, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Hey, Vernon, thought you'd already headed out. Just finished talking to Sheriff Martinez about the upcoming cattle drive. You heading straight home?" Vernon's voice carried the same gentle drawl that ran through the entire Whitmore family, generations of ranchers who'd made southern Arizona their home. "Soon as I can find these damn keys." Clara's frustration was evident as she dumped the contents of her purse onto the hood of her dusty blue Ford pickup. Lipstick, receipts, and coins scattered across the metal surface. "Earl's gonna have my hide if I'm late again." Vernon stepped closer, his shadow providing momentary relief from the blazing sun. "Everything all right between you two? You seemed a little distant during the barrel racing." Clara's hands stilled for a moment. The question hung in the desert air like the heat itself, oppressive and unavoidable. She and Earl had been arguing more frequently, their voices carrying across the ranch yard in the early morning hours when they thought the children were still asleep. Money was tight, the drought was affecting their cattle, and the pressure was showing in the lines around Earl's eyes and the tension in Clara's shoulders. "We're fine," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction, just the usual ranch stress. "You know how it is." Vernon nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "If you ever need to talk, Clara, you know I'm here. Family looks out for family." Clara found her keys wedged between the pages of her checkbook and quickly gathered her scattered belongings. "Appreciate it, Vernon, really, but we'll work things out." She climbed into the truck, the vinyl seats burning against her legs despite her dress. "Tell Martha I said hello." As Clara's truck disappeared down Highway 186, heading toward the Whitmore Ranch 15 miles southeast of town, Vernon stood watching until the dust cloud settled. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Back at the ranch, 8-year-old Tommy and 6-year-old Lena sat at the kitchen table, their homework spread across the scratched wooden surface. Earl paced near the window, checking his watch every few minutes. The house felt different when Clara wasn't there, quieter, more tense, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "Where's Mama?" Lena asked, her pencil hovering over a math worksheet. "She'll be home soon, sweetheart," Earl replied, though his voice carried an edge that made both children look up. "Just finish your work." The sun was setting behind the Dragoon Mountains when Clara's truck should have appeared on the ranch road. 7 o'clock came and went. Then 8. Earl called the fairgrounds, but the grounds crew said they'd seen Clara leave around 5:30. He called Vernon, who confirmed the parking lot conversation but couldn't add anything helpful. By 9 o'clock, Earl was on the phone with Sheriff Martinez, reporting his wife missing. The sheriff, a practical man who'd dealt with plenty of domestic disputes over the years, suggested Clara might have needed some space after an argument. "Give her till morning, Earl. Sometimes folks just need to cool off." But Clara never came home that night, or the next, or ever again. The desert had swallowed her whole, leaving behind only questions and a family that would never be the same. Wilcox, Arizona, July 1995 to August 1995. Sheriff Martinez organized the first official search party 3 days after Clara's disappearance, when it became clear she hadn't simply driven to Phoenix to visit her sister or taken refuge with a friend. The temperature that morning hit 98 degrees before 8 a.m., but 37 volunteers gathered at the fairgrounds anyway, their faces grim with determination. Earl stood at the center of the group, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something hollow and desperate. His blue work shirt was already soaked with sweat, and his hands shook slightly as he held a recent photo of Clara, the family Christmas picture from 8 months earlier, all four of them smiling in front of their modest ranch house. She was wearing a red sundress when she left the rodeo, Earl told the volunteers, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, driving her blue 89 Ford pickup, license plate AZ574 MPR. If anyone saw anything at all. Vernon stood beside his brother, organizing search teams with military precision. As one of the largest landowners in the area, he knew every back road, every arroyo, every place a vehicle might end up if something went wrong. The brothers divided the territory methodically. Some teams would search the highway corridor between the fairgrounds and the ranch. Others would explore the network of dirt roads that spiderwebbed across the desert. Martha Henderson, Clara's closest friend and neighbor, led a group of women from their church. Clara wouldn't just leave, she insisted to anyone who'd listen. She loves those kids more than life itself. Something happened to her. But as the hours stretched into days and days into weeks, doubts began to creep in. Clara and Earl's marriage had been strained. Everyone knew that. Money troubles weren't uncommon among the ranching families, and the drought had hit everyone hard. Some whispered that Clara had finally had enough, that she'd planned her disappearance to start fresh somewhere else. The theory gained traction when Clara's bank records revealed she'd withdrawn $200 the day before the rodeo. Not an enormous sum, but enough to suggest advance planning. Earl couldn't explain the withdrawal, claiming he hadn't known about it until the sheriff brought it to his attention. Maybe she was buying supplies for the kids, school clothes, he suggested weakly. Clara handled most of the household finances. Detective Ray Campos from the Cochise County Sheriff's Department took over the investigation in August. A methodical man with 20 years of experience, he interviewed everyone who'd been at the rodeo, retraced Clara's movements, and examined every piece of evidence with careful attention to detail. "Wasn't the thing about missing persons cases," he explained to Earl during one of their many conversations, "is that people don't usually just vanish. There's almost always a reason, a pattern, something that explains what happened." But Clara's case defied easy explanation. She wasn't depressed or suicidal, at least not according to her friends and family. She hadn't been having an affair, hadn't been in debt beyond the normal ranch obligations, hadn't expressed any desire to leave Wilcox. Her personal belongings remained in the house, including jewelry that Earl insisted she treasured. The only real clue was the truck. Despite extensive searches of the desert roads, Clara's blue Ford pickup was never found. It was as if both woman and vehicle had simply dissolved into the vast emptiness of southeastern Arizona. As summer turned to fall, the official search efforts wound down. Volunteers returned to their own lives, their own problems. The story moved from the front page of the Wilcox Range News to the inside pages, then disappeared altogether. Earl hired a private investigator with money borrowed against the ranch, but after 3 months of fruitless searching, even that effort ended. The children adapted the way children do, with resilience that was both heartbreaking and remarkable. Tommy threw himself into school and sports, becoming the kind of responsible older brother who helped Lena with her homework and made sure she got to school on time. Lena, too young to fully understand what had happened, asked about her mother less and less as the months passed. Earl changed too. The easygoing rancher who'd once been quick with a joke or a helping hand became distant, preoccupied. He spent long hours working the cattle, often staying out until well past dark. When neighbors tried to help with the children or bring casseroles, he accepted their assistance with polite gratitude but kept his distance emotionally. "Clara left us," he began telling people when they asked. "Found someone else, I guess. Happens sometimes." The explanation was delivered without emotion, as if he was commenting on the weather or the price of cattle. But late at night, when the desert wind rattled the windows and the children were asleep, Earl would sit in his truck in the driveway and stare out at the darkness, wondering what he could have done differently. The questions ate at him like the desert ate at everything else. Slowly, relentlessly, leaving only empty spaces where something vital used to be. By Christmas 1995, most people in Wilcox had accepted Earl's version of events. Clara Whitmore had abandoned her family, plain and simple. It was easier to believe than considering the alternatives that might be lurking in the vast emptiness surrounding their small community. The desert kept its secrets, and life moved on. Wilcox, Arizona, March 2024. 29 years later, Lena Whitmore Morrison stood in the barn where she'd once helped her father feed cattle, holding a shovel and staring at a patch of disturbed earth near the back wall. The March wind carried the familiar scent of creosote and dust through the open doors, but everything else about the place felt foreign to her now. At 35, Lena bore little resemblance to the 6-year-old who'd waited for her mother to come home. Her auburn hair was cut in a practical bob, and her hands showed the soft calluses of someone who worked in an office rather than on a ranch. She'd made a life for herself in Portland, Oregon, far from the desert, far from the memories, far from the questions that had no answers. Earl had died of a heart attack 6 months earlier, leaving the ranch to his children. Tommy, now a truck driver based in Phoenix, had no interest in maintaining the property. "Sell it," he'd told Lena over the phone. "Use the money for your kids' college funds. Dad's been gone longer than he was ever really here anyway." But Lena couldn't bring herself to call a realtor without first going through her father's belongings. Some part of her, the part that had never stopped being that 6-year-old girl, hoped she might find something that would finally explain what had happened to her mother. The main house had yielded nothing but the usual accumulation of a long life: financial records, faded photographs, tools and equipment gathered over decades of ranching. Lena had spent 3 days sorting through it all, finding a certain peace in the methodical work of categorizing and organizing. The barn, however, had presented a mystery. While cleaning out the old tack room, Lena had noticed that one section of the dirt floor looked different from the rest, darker, more compact, as if it had been disturbed and then carefully smoothed over. The anomaly might have escaped notice entirely, if not for the way the afternoon light slanted through the window, highlighting the subtle difference in texture. Now, with the shovel biting into the hard-packed earth, Lena wondered if she was losing her mind. What did she expect to find? More importantly, what was she afraid she might find? 3 feet down, the shovel struck something metal with a hollow clang that echoed through the barn. Lena's heart hammered as she dropped to her knees and began clearing away dirt with her hands. The object was a metal box about the size of a large shoebox, with rust eating at its edges, but the structure still intact. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a white towel, Lena found items that made her breath catch in her throat. A silver bracelet she recognized from childhood photos, her mother's favorite, the one with tiny turquoise stones that caught the light. A small collection of photographs showing Clara at various ranch events, many featuring Vernon Whitmore standing close beside her, his hand often resting on her shoulder or waist in a way that seemed more than brotherly. But it was the key that made Lena's hands shake. Attached to a small metal tag that read, "Mesa Storage, Unit 42, it represented a mystery that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. Lena drove to Mesa that same afternoon, the 2-hour journey giving her time to process what she'd found and to prepare herself for what might be waiting. The storage facility was a sprawling complex of beige buildings on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where people stored the overflow of their lives and sometimes forgot about it entirely. The facility manager, a weathered man named Jim Rodriguez, checked his records when Lena explained her situation. Unit 42's been paid up automatically through a bank account for, almost 30 years now. Account belongs to Vernon Whitmore. You're sure you have authorization to access it? Lena showed him the key and explained about her father's death, her inheritance of the ranch, and her discovery of the buried box. Something in her manner convinced him to bend the rules, though he insisted on accompanying her to the unit. The metal door rolled up with a screech of protest, revealing a space that had been carefully organized despite decades of abandonment. Clara's personal belongings were arranged almost like a museum display, her clothes hanging neatly on a rod, her jewelry box sitting on a small table, even her makeup and toiletries arranged on a shelf as if she might return for them at any moment. But it was the journals that provided the real revelation. 3 spiral-bound notebooks filled with Clara's careful handwriting documented the final months of her life in devastating detail. "Vernon says Earl doesn't have to know," read one entry from June 1995. "He says we can work something out, that the ranch can support both families if we're smart about it, but I don't know if I can keep living this lie." Another entry, dated just days before her disappearance, was even more explicit. "I told Vernon I was going to tell Earl everything after the rodeo. He got so angry, angrier than I've ever seen him. Said I'd destroy both our families over something that didn't have to matter. But it does matter. The children deserve to know the truth about their father." Lena read the journals with growing horror and understanding. Her mother hadn't abandoned the family. She'd been caught in an impossible situation, torn between loyalty to her husband and a relationship with his brother that had apparently been going on for years. The final entries suggested Clara had decided to confess everything, to clear the air and deal with the consequences, but there had been no confession. Clara had simply vanished. At the bottom of a box containing Clara's winter clothes, Lena found one more item that changed everything. A piece of fabric that was clearly stained with something dark and long-dried. Even after nearly 30 years, the implications were unmistakable. As Lena sat in the storage unit surrounded by the carefully preserved remnants of her mother's life, one thing became crystal clear. Clara Whitmore hadn't left voluntarily. Someone had made sure she never got the chance to tell her story, and that someone had been protecting their secret ever since. Wilcox, Arizona, April 2024. Detective Rafael Mendoza had seen enough missing persons cases to know that family secrets rarely stayed buried forever. When Lena Whitmore Morrison walked into the Cochise County Sheriff's Department with a storage unit key and 3 decades worth of questions, he recognized the look in her eyes, the mixture of hope and dread that came with finally having a thread to pull. At 45, Mendoza was the kind of investigator who treated cold cases like archaeological digs, carefully excavating layers of time and lies until the truth emerged. He'd transferred to Wilcox 3 years earlier from Tucson, drawn by the promise of a slower pace. But cases like Clara Whitmore's reminded him that small towns often harbored the deepest secrets. "I need you to understand," he told Lena, as they sat in his cramped office. Clara's journals spread across his desk like evidence of a life interrupted. "That reopening this case means reopening old wounds. For your family, for the community, for everyone who's spent 30 years believing one version of events." Lena nodded, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "I understand, but I can't unknow what I know now. My mother didn't abandon us. Someone killed her." The physical evidence supported Lena's conclusion. The fabric found in the storage unit tested positive for human blood, type O negative, which matched Clara's medical records. More importantly, DNA analysis revealed traces of DNA that didn't belong to Clara, though it would take weeks to run those samples through the databases and attempt to find a match. Mendoza's first stop was Vernon Whitmore's ranch, 5 miles north of where Earl had raised his family. At 78, Vernon had aged into the kind of distinguished older man who commanded respect at church socials and town council meetings. His wife Martha had died 4 years earlier, and he lived alone in the sprawling adobe house he'd built in the 1980s, when cattle prices were high and the future looked bright. "Detective Mendoza," Vernon said, settling into a leather recliner in his living room. "I figured someone would come around eventually. Heard Lena was back in town going through Earl's things. Some stones are better left unturned, if you ask me." The detective studied Vernon's face, looking for tells, for signs of deception or guilt. What he saw was resignation, as if the man had been waiting for this conversation for decades. "Tell me about Clara," Mendoza said simply. Vernon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a family photograph on the mantelpiece. 3 generations of Whitmores gathered for a Christmas celebration sometime in the early 1990s. Clara stood beside Earl, her arm around Lena, everyone smiling as if they didn't have a care in the world. "Clara was," Vernon began, then stopped. "Clara was the best thing that ever happened to this family, and we destroyed her, all of us, in our own ways." The confession came slowly, in fragments that Mendoza had to piece together like a puzzle missing half its pieces. Vernon admitted to an affair with Clara that had begun 2 years before her disappearance, a relationship born out of loneliness and proximity, but sustained by genuine affection. Earl was so wrapped up in keeping the ranch afloat, he stopped seeing Clara as anything but another responsibility, Vernon explained. "She was lonely. I was lonely after Martha lost the baby we'd been trying for. It just happened. Neither of us planned it. But when Clara decided to end the affair and tell Earl the truth, Vernon panicked. He met her at the fairgrounds after the rodeo, not to say goodbye, but to convince her to keep their secret. I followed her part-way home," Vernon admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Flagged her down at the old cattle crossing on Section Road 12. We argued. She was determined to tell Earl everything. Said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore." Mendoza leaned forward. "What happened then, Vernon?" "She slapped me, called me a coward, said I was more worried about my reputation than her marriage." Vernon's hands shook as he reached for a glass of water. "I grabbed her arm to stop her from walking away, and she fell, hit her head on the truck's bumper." The detective waited, knowing that the most important part of the story was often found in the silences between words. "She was bleeding," Vernon continued. "Unconscious. I thought she was dead. I panicked, loaded her into her truck and drove out to the old mine shaft on my property. By the time I realized she was still breathing, it was too late. I'd already made my choice. But even as Vernon confessed, Mendoza sensed there were still pieces missing from the story. The storage unit, for instance. Why preserve Clara's belongings so carefully if this was just a crime of passion? And why had Vernon helped organize the search parties, knowing full well that Clara would never be found? Who else knew? Mendoza asked. Vernon's silence stretched long enough that the detective knew he'd hit something important. Vernon, who else knew what happened to Clara? The old man's shoulders sagged as if a weight he'd been carrying for 30 years had finally become too heavy. Earl knew, he whispered. Not at first, but Earl knew. Wilcox, Arizona, May 2024. The arrest of Vernon Whitmore sent shockwaves through the small desert community, but it was the discovery of additional evidence that truly shattered the carefully constructed narrative that had defined the Whitmore family for 3 decades. Detective Mendoza found the answer in Clara's own handwriting, hidden in the pages of a journal that had been overlooked during the initial examination of the storage unit. Tucked between entries about ranch life and reflections on her troubled marriage, Clara had written a letter she'd never intended to send, a confession addressed to Earl, dated 2 weeks after her supposed disappearance. "My dear Earl," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you know the truth about Vernon and me. I pray you can find it in your heart to forgive us both." But the letter wasn't written by a dead woman. As Mendoza pieced together the evidence, a different story emerged, one that made Vernon's confession only half the truth. Clara hadn't died at the cattle crossing. She'd been injured, yes, and Vernon had panicked, but instead of killing her, he'd hidden her at his ranch while he figured out what to do. For 2 weeks, Clara had remained there, recovering from her head injury, while Vernon wrestled with his conscience and his fear. During those 2 weeks, Clara had written extensively in her journal, documenting her captivity and her growing realization that Vernon would never let her go free. She'd also discovered something that changed everything. Documents in Vernon's study that revealed Earl had known about the affair all along. "Earl has been taking money from Vernon for months," Clara wrote. "Payment for his silence, for his willingness to look the other way. My husband sold me to his brother for the price of keeping the ranch afloat." The financial records supported Clara's discovery. Earl had been struggling with debt throughout 1994 and early 1995, but mysterious cash deposits had appeared in his accounts regularly, always in amounts that corresponded to payments from Vernon's various business dealings. Earl hadn't been a victim of his wife's infidelity. He'd been a willing participant in the arrangement that traded Clara's companionship for financial stability. When Clara decided to end the affair, both brothers had too much to lose. The truth about Clara's final moments came from an unexpected source, a tape recording found in Vernon's house during the search warrant execution. Apparently, Vernon had recorded conversations during Clara's captivity, perhaps as insurance against Earl, or perhaps as evidence of his own torment over the situation. The recording was difficult to listen to, Clara's voice weak but determined as she confronted both brothers about their betrayal. "You sold me," she accused Earl. "Your own wife. For what?" "To save a ranch that's been failing for years anyway." Earl's response was chilling in its coldness. "You made your choice, Clara. Now you live with the consequences." "I won't live like this," Clara replied. "I won't be your dirty little secret anymore. Either you let me go or I'll find a way to tell everyone what kind of men you really are." The recording ended abruptly, but the forensic evidence told the rest of the story. Clara had been killed not in a moment of passion at the cattle crossing, but in cold blood at Vernon's ranch, with Earl present and participating. The brothers had then carefully orchestrated the cover-up, creating the storage unit as a kind of shrine to their guilt while maintaining the fiction that Clara had abandoned her family. Earl's death 6 months earlier had been ruled natural causes, but as Mendoza reviewed the medical examiner's report, he noted signs consistent with the stress and guilt that had apparently consumed the man for 30 years. In a way, Earl had served his own life sentence, carrying the weight of his wife's murder until his heart literally couldn't bear it anymore. The arrest of Vernon Whitmore was anticlimactic, compared to the revelation that the entire community had been living with a lie for 3 decades. The man who'd helped organize search parties, who'd comforted Clara's children, who'd been trusted and respected by everyone in Wilcox, had been one of her killers all along. But it was Lena's final statement to the press that captured the true tragedy of the case. Standing outside the courthouse where Vernon had been arraigned, She spoke directly to the news cameras with a composure that belied the devastation in her eyes. "For 30 years, my brother and I believed our mother abandoned us," she said. "We grew up thinking we weren't enough to make her stay, that something was wrong with us that drove her away. The truth is worse than we ever imagined. She didn't leave us. She was taken from us by the two men she should have been able to trust most." As Lena drove away from Wilcox for what she knew would be the last time, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, keeping its remaining secrets beneath the relentless Arizona sun. Clara Whitmore had finally found her voice, but it had taken nearly 3 decades for anyone to hear what she'd been trying to say all along. The case was officially closed, but the questions it raised about trust, family, and the lies people tell themselves to survive would linger in the small desert community long after the news cameras had moved on to other stories. In the end, the desert had kept Clara's secret, just as Vernon and Earl had intended. But secrets, like the desert itself, have a way of shifting over time, revealing what was always there beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig.